Thanks for listening to the Scottish Housing Podcast. You can find out more about the presenters by going to scottishhousingpod.com, and you can also follow us on social media. We are on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok and Facebook. Just look up at Scottish Housing Pod.
Thanks very much, Miles, for joining us. Always like to get a wee bit of background on our guests so that you can introduce yourself. So you, born in Preston, brought up in Perthshire, and an MSP for the Conservative Party. So do you want to give us a bit of your history here and tell us how you've ended up being speaking to us here about housing from Holyrood?
Sure. So I have been an MSP for just over 7 years. The last session, I pretty much covered the health portfolio for most of that time, but have been doing housing and social justice in this session of Parliament. So that's really where my housing interest has come from. I don't have a housing background, so it's been a real learning curve, but then it's probably been one of the most volatile times in housing in Scotland during this time. So it's been a real learning curve for me, and I think for many people who work in the sector in Scotland, I've been grateful for the information they've kind of given me in either supporting things that are happening or being dead against them. But I think it's quite a worrying time in housing policy terms in Scotland at the minute. And kind of it's really important, I think, for all of us in Parliament to start to really look at how we unpick some of that as well.
Yeah, you mentioned no massive background in housing. It is one of the things I find interesting, and my taste for the challenges that politicians have come with my normal co-host, Stephen Purcell. And then 10, 12 years ago, I worked quite a bit with, interacted with Scottish Government ministers. And I found, got a greater appreciation of the challenges that politicians like yourself have, that you get given a brief and then everybody piles in because they all want to speak to the new spokesman or the new minister, and you're expected to know everything instantly about it. So it must be quite a challenge trying to grasp every nuance of every aspect of a new brief when you get it. There must be quite a lot of hours that you have to put in.
Yeah, there's something in politics, I think, when someone has a knowledge of something, they tend not to end up in these portfolios. And you see that in government as well. Many teachers don't end up being education ministers. The current education minister is probably the exception to that rule. But yeah, I think it's quite healthy. I love, one thing I love about this job is you are learning all the time on it. And in terms of housing policy, it's something I've, as an MSP here in Edinburgh, been acutely kind of working on issues and aware of some of the problems which we faced in what is basically an overheated market here in the capital. So yeah, we need to learn, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think it keeps you agile and it makes you actually do the job better, I think, when you're not coming to this with your own preconceptions of a policy. You hopefully are open to all suggestions and listening to both sides of the argument as well.
Yeah, so I mean, I remember always going about this about 20 years ago, speaking to a journalist I was friendly with and trying to get him to write us some stories about property. And he said, well, property's not front page news. I can't get my editor to write a housing story. Mm-hmm. But that's not been the case in the period that you've then become housing and social justice spokesman for the Conservative Party in Scotland, because it really is now starting to ratchet up through, I think, through house prices going up quite a bit, the number of people who find themselves on affordable housing waiting lists, and of course the recent legislative changes that we've had in the private housing sector. So it's now something that's starting to become quite newsworthy. So can you give us a bit of a flavour of the Conservative Party's position on lots of the issues that are going on just now in the housing sector, and then we can start to drill down on some of those points?
Sure, no, absolutely. I don't think we're quite there yet. You know, one of the things I found with this portfolio is housing stories don't really get the coverage I would have hoped and thought they would. unless there's a real scandal behind statistics, and we've seen that with the homelessness statistics. When they're published, there's a lot of interest, but some of the other issues don't really get the sort of wider coverage which you would think they would. Lower levels of completions, things like that, don't seem to really then get into maybe print media, but the wider public conscience. So I think housing policy sometimes isn't the sort of sexy thing journalists are looking for, or the capturing the imagination in stories. So I think we've all got maybe more work to do to really understand where housing should be at the heart of all our policy development. And that's something I've thought for a while, because when I did the health portfolio, I think one of the biggest challenges which always came forward was often when someone's got poor quality housing, that is why they're in the NHS a lot of the time. So if you've got poor housing, which is impacting on respiratory issues, you're in and out of hospital, you're in and out of A&E, and the cost of looking after you and the NHS spend on you compared to the housing side isn't integrated in a way which you would have thought when we did integration of health and social care. Housing should have been at the heart of that as well. And some of the poorest housing stock levels we've got haven't really been addressed. So in terms of policy, I think we need to really look at where we're at. And that's one of the things in terms of the government accepting that we're facing a housing crisis in many parts of the country. My own area here in Edinburgh, Glasgow, Argyll and Bute, most councils now are looking towards declaring a housing emergency. So I think, politically speaking, I think we need to be honest about where the challenge now has really built up. And, declaring a housing emergency isn't going to solve things overnight, but at least gives the emphasis of parliamentarians having to look towards a cross-portfolio solution to what is becoming a more and more difficult housing problem across Scotland. And I think that's where, for the Scottish Government to really understand how difficult things are, doesn't seem to really have cut through yet. There's a few things I've been calling for and believe kind of we need a real focus. And the main one has been around empty properties. We know across Scotland there's 43,000 empty properties currently. A lot of those are owned by councils, for example, who don't have the budgets, haven't audited them, to look towards actually how we can get as many of these back into use. And then beyond that, I think we need a vision around how are we going to deliver the home Scotland need. Housing to 2040, we're clearly not going to meet those targets. And that's something I think the Scottish Government needs to start to understand. You can set yourself a target way out to like 2040, but we're now looking at how and when that's going to be met. And, I've raised issues with ministers where they've talked about peaks and troughs, but in terms of housing developments, all we've seen is a set of troughs we're currently in. So the likelihood of us meeting housing to 2040 is now unrealistic. And I think that really makes us all need to take stock and look towards what we can do differently, both in terms of private development and social housing as well. And I think there's a lot of slowdown, which I'm really concerned about, which has been impacted on, let's face it, by some of the policies during and post-pandemic around rent controls, and also looking towards investment in the sector, which is quite frankly, drying up at the minute, which is really concerning, I think, when we look towards what we should be building currently, and we just aren't.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of points you raised there, and I suppose they fall into different categories of the challenges that all politicians have in trying to tie things up. And one of the things you mentioned there is the sort of a cross area that housing has an impact on different things. So it has an impact on health. There's an impact on economics. So if we look first of all on, the basic challenge we've got, whether it's the private or the public sector, is a demand and supply is out of kilter. So we're not supplying the right number of houses. So one of the challenges there obviously is partly economic, in that increasingly, and this is reflected across Europe, it's not peculiar to Scotland. Increasingly, what we're seeing is the jobs are all concentrated in Scotland, in Glasgow, Edinburgh, particularly in those two ends of the M8, for want of a better way of putting it. And that's where you've got a big amount of housing need. But of course, that's where the land is most expensive, which means we've seen a lot of, we've seen the issue with Stuart Milne going out of business. And then we've seen a number of new build house builders talking about they can't make the profit that they need to make out of housing. Because the cost of building the houses, and the biggest cost of building the houses is the land, or one of the biggest costs is the land, and then the return on their investment that they can get. And of course, in other areas, like you mentioned, Argyll and Bute, somewhere like that, where there's in rural locations, you can have housing challenges. And the issue there is, although the land might be cheaper, they can't get the property price that they need there. So how do you deal with that type of that? Some of that's economic. How do you deal with that?
Yeah. The $1 million question there, there's lots of problems. I think what we need to do, though, is break that down. So look towards my own area where I'm closest to, for example, in Edinburgh. Most of the development sites are brownfield. And when you look at local plans, what developers are being told will be the land available, it's unlikely that this land is going to come forward. And so they're, transitioning away from Edinburgh at the very same time we are seeing the population growth through here. So I was on a call this morning with our health board in Lothian, where we're looking towards a 25% increase in our population over the next decade here in Lothian. Now that's all outstripping the rest of Scotland hugely. So the East will be becoming kind of where people want to live and work and play. And, we need to start planning for that in a way we just haven't been. So I do think National Planning Framework 4, which I was involved with at a committee, is failing us around housing, and we need to have a complete look at that again. The Local Government and Housing Committee, which I sit on, is about to undertake a sort of health check into that. So I hope that's an opportunity for us to really look towards what needs to change to look at land supply for housing. One of the suggestions I've made, and government haven't really taken this forward, but I think is something we should be doing, is doing an audit of public land available as well for development. I think there's a huge opportunity, for example, for housing associations, if we can identify and audit bits of land where they could develop that for social housing. And that's across our portfolios. I'm talking about councils, NHS boards, Forestry Commission, you name it, organisations which are public bodies with public land. If there are development sites, these could be then, I think, zoned for housing, even, one-off blocks of flats, given the housing crisis we're facing. And that would undercut quite substantially the cost of land. It's publicly owned land, let's face it. So I hope that's something the government will start to really consider, because the land supply just isn't there. Now, for rural areas, I was on the Western Isles actually doing an inquiry recently, and completely different challenge there. But what is quite key, I think, is then key workers not being able to find homes. And what was really interesting was some of the work, different models which the council was really leading over there to find accommodation for people, and putting out a call for accommodation, but then looking at actually small scale development. And we know the unit costs of building housing is so substantial now that 2 or 3 units just isn't viable for many developers. So I think there's also a probably new model we need to look towards for smaller scale, whether or not that's conversion, whether or not that's empty properties we could get back into use, and that would be less cost to the taxpayer if it is a taxpayer funded project. But I think we need to look at those different models. It kind of feels like at the minute we're just using the same for urban and rural Scotland, and not actually progressing very far at all in meeting our housing needs wherever you live in Scotland or want to live in Scotland.
One of the things, I was listening to a podcast recently. It was an interview with Sajid Javid, and he was being asked about what he really noticed when he became a minister in government, and he said it was the thing that from the outside it looks very easy to say, just go and do this and just go and do that. Yes. And it's just you talking about the change of government attitude. He said the biggest thing you realise once you're in government is there are very good reasons why it takes 18 months, 2 years for any decision to happen and anything to change, because you've got to go through so many consultations and things like that. But you mentioned about the land, I know certainly from my interaction nearly 10 years ago now with Scottish government officials, that the issue about land was, oh, well, we've got to be seen to be doing the right thing in terms of getting maximum value for the public purse, and not skewing off land and parcelling it up. So I suppose that's one of those things that Sajid Javid was talking about. It's one of those things that, and that you touched on, it's government's always done it this way, and it's really difficult to change that culture and mentality of, I suppose what I'm saying is, the job of someone like yourself is to find a way of creating that argument as to why it is best value for the public purse that the housing finds its way to registered social landlords as opposed to just going on the open market.
Yeah,
and
I think
how would you challenge that?
Yeah, so, I probably agree with those comments. Sometimes it feels like, we pass a law in here and then it gets dumped on a shelf somewhere. And guidance, MPF 4 is one of those documents where councils, had been working on an old one, then they saw what we were doing with a new one. And whether or not that's aligned to their local plans isn't quite clear for some councils. And the land availability, like I say, around brownfield sites in Edinburgh, there's some large parts of the city currently being used for, motor showrooms, cat and dog home, for example. That's zoned for housing. It's just unlikely to be bringing these development sites forward. So I think being realistic, and for politicians, both, at Scottish Parliament, Westminster, council levels, to really try to get a solution built is more important than as kind of sometimes just deciding to disagree on everything. And I don't think we've aligned what we need and where the housing is needed to what is a national planning framework. It's a document which then gets filtered into 32 councils. So I hope there's kind of a point in time when we will have a plan that has to be flexible, but we can start to sort of say, well, how do you collectively try to meet what Scotland needs in the future? Our housing mix, we haven't touched on that, but we also need to see the houses we're building change as well. I certainly think, the sort of smaller pensioner development housing seems to have disappeared. And at the other end, larger families as well, looking for 4 or 5 bedroomed homes, that's not existing either. It tends to be a 2-bedroom flat model, which we've built in social housing. So there's some really good examples of housing associations doing things differently, but they're sometimes not the norm. They're very much standing out. A couple of developments I've been lucky enough to visit, it's where you've seen that different type of model develop. So I think we need to probably politically really start to consider, where are we going with this, and how are we going to fund this? We know the financial pressures on the housing budget, but I don't think we've really got our ducks in a row of what we're trying to achieve. And the strategies, like I've said, like Housing to 2040, aren't worth the paper they're written on when they're not actually delivering the results in the real world across Scotland. So I think that is where the role I've got to play as opposition housing spokesperson is really to hold the government to account on some of this, and to really see where they are going to flex, because there's no point us carrying on like this and just building up housing problems in Scotland. Something will have to break at some point, and we'll need to, kind of like the drug deaths, and I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, when drug deaths really got to a point where they were the worst in Europe, the Scottish Government had to accept something has gone drastically wrong. And I do really get concerned that we are in a position now where we're seeing homelessness, people in temporary accommodation, housing completions just, not to the level they need to be. But a government saying, well, it'll be all right on the night, we're doing our best, and next year the statistics are worse. We really need, I think, to take stock and collectively, as a parliament, look towards different solutions for that. And that's certainly something I want to be involved with and constructively trying to work with government on, because a housing crisis isn't something Scotland should be facing. We should be able to develop solutions.
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges, and you keep making reference to the social housing sector, and maybe I'm maligning them unfairly. My perception when I interacted with them was really good people in there, so I'm not decrying, but the culture around it was, one, they were permanently in fear of the Scottish housing regulator, that if they did something that was a bit too innovative or a bit too bullish, that was a risk that was not necessary for them to put into the sector. As one housing chief executive said to me once, I've got 5,000 people on my waiting list. If I go and borrow 5-6 million quid, I've just added risk into the financial position of my housing association, and I've effectively still got 5,000 people on my waiting list because I've only built 50 houses. That's one of the challenges, that it does seem to me that culture is very risk averse for very understandable reasons. You don't want our biggest landlords going about things in a very haphazard fashion, but equally, that then stifles innovation to try and come up with new ideas that you've just been talking about. Have you got any thoughts about how you could encourage a bit more innovation in the social housing sector?
Yeah, so I think you're right, and they have been small c conservative for a period. I think part of the problem is they've had some real issues with policy changes recently, which have undermined the sector, let's be quite honest. So the rent control policy, which they were included in, through a lot of lobbying, I managed to get government to take them out. Mid-market rent is still in there and shouldn't be. But that really has seen them have to completely rewrite their investment plans, both in terms of current housing stock upgrade, but future development. So, they've been kind of, the government have scared the horses, and you can see where housing associations now are just knuckling down to try to invest in their current plans, and have rewritten their future business plans and attracting that investment. I know from discussions I've had with developers as well, they've been looking to the north of England instead of Scotland for safer, less risky developments. Now, that's the last thing we need to see. I think our new housing minister, from what he's told me, is trying to reverse some of that. But the instability around rent controls and around a sector which has seen so many different housing policy changes in the last 2 to 3 years, has seen them just knuckle down and wait to see what's coming. So I think that's why we've also seen this situation where we have seen some of the lowest completion levels for social housing we've ever seen in Scotland. So we need to get back to creating that environment where they feel safe to invest. And actually, like I mentioned earlier, some of the role of councils around empty homes, I think there's also work we could be doing with our social rented sector and housing associations to see how they could take on some more management of that as well. But it's about the environment they're operating in, and most of them have just been quite sort of knuckled down to what their basic work has been to date. I hope we're heading into a space where they will feel they can really push on and create more affordable housing than they have to date.
So we've skirted around the topic. The elephant in the room is, of course, the rent controls and the impact. And you mentioned the impact there. I know where we are in the Scottish housing market for a good 20 years or so, or maybe even more now, we've had about 60% of the properties are private owner occupied. And that leaves roughly the other 40% in some form of rented accommodation, either social rent or private rent. And of course, the private rented sector has been the sector that's grown most in that last 20 years. And the last couple of 18 months or so, we've seen the rent controls put in. I'm not going to editorialise here with my own opinion on that. So I want to hear from you, Miles, on what were your thoughts when the rent controls came in? What were you saying about them? And what are your thoughts now they're coming to an end to some extent?
Sure. So when you look across the world where rent controls have been used, as an emergency post-pandemic response, we were told they would be, it was quite clear that one thing it would have is rent increases in the long term for people. And for many in the private rented sector, a likelihood that they would also look to potentially leave. Now, we warned the government about that because anywhere in the world, that is the outcome of a rent controls which has sprung on to people. We're now sadly seeing that come to fruition. And, some of the data which is coming through from different letting agents, landlords, is that people are looking to come out of the market. Now, I really worry about the private rented sector. As an MSP in the last Parliament or pre-pandemic, I did quite a lot of work with homeless people here in Edinburgh and the council to put together sustainable tenancies with the private rented sector, which they have to be part of the solution. And that has all dried up. I've not seen any of that work taking place. And the social rented sector have also not filled that gap. So this is why we are seeing record number of people in temporary accommodation now in Edinburgh. 10,000 children living in temporary accommodation, totally unacceptable situations. But the solution in that mixed market solution is just not going to be there. So I do worry where we now are with the housing bill and what we're hearing from SNP and Green ministers about embedding rent controls in the future. The current set of rent control plans around 6% increase, and then beyond that, landlords, being able to potentially put rents up to 12%. That looks like the model they might embed into the housing bill. But there's been no consultation, there's been no real understanding about impact. And I'm really concerned what we're doing will be like what we've seen in Dublin, where demand and supply pretty much will rule on this. And people, especially people who maybe have one property they rent out, in Edinburgh anyway, are probably likely to not want to be a landlord and will sell that. And given the market as it is, these will disappear out of the rented sector. So I am concerned that unintended consequences kind of feel like they're about to come through here in Edinburgh. And certainly those who are working in the sector are telling me they're starting to have more and more people looking towards selling what was private rented sector flats here in the capital. So it is a disturbing time, and rents are only going to go up. So a rent freeze, rent control hasn't worked.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned there about people wanting to leave the sector. I was really surprised. I saw a Freedom of Information request to the Scottish Government about what percentage of registered landlords in Scotland only rent out one property. And it was pushing 95%. I always knew it was over 3/4, but I was really surprised to see that it was that number of single landlord proprietors. And as you say, if they are frightened out of the sector and you see a mass migration, then that's a real challenge for us. At the opposite end of the scale, one area that has been looking to grow has been the build to let, I should say, sector. And everything that I'm hearing is that they've been frightened away from Scotland when they saw Glasgow and Edinburgh in particular as being two places where they were great places to be getting institutional investment in the build to rent sector in the UK. And so they pulled back. But at the same time, the argument put forward by the Scottish Government and Greens and the SNP would be we needed to do something because rents were just getting out of control. So how would you balance that challenge of you don't want to scare the horses of the build to rent sector coming in, but you also need to look after the challenges that the tenants have got of seeing their rents go up? How would you deal with that?
So that mixed market approach, I think, is key. And, when you look at some of the buy-to-let projects which were happening and, investment potential for people pre-pandemic, that just isn't happening. Most developers are saying they're just not seeing clients come forward for that. Now, that shouldn't be how you just provide social rented properties or private rented properties for people. But that was a key part of actually more housing being made available. And like you said earlier, I think we need to understand what the market looks like. It's not people with huge property portfolios. This is often people who have inherited a property. It might be a flat which their children have used and then they've kept that on to rent out. It might be people who have done that investment opportunity by a buy-to-let for their pension. Everyone in that space has been doing that on a micro scale, really. Let's face it, they do not have teams of people. They might have a factor who runs these, but beyond that, this has been a cottage industry for many people, and many now feel they've been treated like bad landlords. And I'm the first to say, anyone who is a bad landlord, we need to take action if they're not looking after the properties and individuals they're renting flats out to. But we have got a situation where most people feel we have a Scottish government who wants to target them and get them out of the market. And that is filtered through to how people now don't want to be renting out property. And in Edinburgh, I think, given the cost of living for people, releasing that capital will be, I think, one of the things most people look to do, which will significantly reduce opportunities for people to rent. And we're not seeing that yet, but I do think by the summer, and certainly when students come back in September, this is going to be a major problem. And already the universities, I've had a couple of meetings with the universities, are putting in place plans and saying to students, because that is also a key factor for Edinburgh anyway, and Glasgow, that the numbers of students and the accommodation is not going to match in the future. So the universities are going to have to do something very different come September if people are able to return to their studies, as well as the increasingly numbers of international students which universities rely on to pay their institutions, really. So there's so many challenges which I don't think we've kind of connected. And I say that I do have a lot of time for the new housing minister. I think some of the opportunities he could unpick some of this, he's not necessarily taken yet. But we need to really look at how the housing market has been destabilised by rent controls and how we try to smooth that out going forward so it doesn't have the impact like we've seen in Ireland, like we've seen in Dublin specifically, and Scotland and Ireland not hugely different in what could be a total disaster going forward with future rent controls. And a housing bill, let's face it, which we don't really know what's included. I'm not quite sure whether or not this housing bill should be our focus. I think maybe what we should be doing is tackling all the problems we've currently got, and Scottish Government, Scottish Parliament should be focused on that, not another housing bill, which, as far as I can see, is just embedding some of the housing duties we already have, isn't really radically going to change much, but will distract a huge amount from the challenges we're currently facing. So I do think it's probably time for us to consider whether or not a housing bill is needed, at least this side of the Scottish Parliament election, and the next 2 years should be really focused on the housing emergency we're currently facing.
Just on a side on your comment there about additional legislation, I do always look, and particularly the recent conversation around rent controls, I do always look at the last housing bill that came in Scotland that specifically had a provision for councils to bring in rental pressure zones. And the legislation was so poorly written that at the time people said no council will actually be able to put in rent pressure zones. And no councils have brought in rent pressure zones. So we actually had some form of ability to try and control rents in the last piece of legislation that was brought in, but it was so badly written that it's never actually been utilised. So I think perhaps I agree with you that maybe we should take some time and make sure we get things right rather than rush into new legislation. One of the other things...
Politics can...
Sorry, carry on.
No, it's just politics can sometimes, push this in a way which isn't helpful. So the conversation I saw, coming out of the pandemic was the Labour Party proposing rent controls. The SNP hadn't really ever mentioned them. We then saw the Greens supporting them, and then all of a sudden a rent control policy unconsulted comes out of nowhere. Now, Labour are running a million miles away from rent controls, having kind of forced the Scottish Government and Greens to do what they've done during this period. But, that's a planned approach to what we're doing and policy interventions, and the unintended consequences they will always have hasn't really been looked at and hasn't really been factored in. And I do worry we're still taking decisions, or the Scottish Government are taking decisions on policy. We haven't really looked at the data and how that's impacting. And for rural Scotland, a loss of one home is huge. For urban Scotland, loss of thousands will make a huge impact. But I think we will see differential impacts in different parts of the country from these policies. And we should have been really mindful around that, because it is dangerous when we start meddling and human behaviour then results in fewer homes available. That's something I think in politics we need to be mindful of when we're taking these decisions.
Yeah, and the other thing you've mentioned, you continually mention the unintended consequences of an action in one place having an impact somewhere else, and how integrated housing is. One of my thoughts on that was when you touched on there about the universities. Of course, we've got free university education in Scotland, which lots of merit to that. The challenge of that, of course, is that the universities have then gone and sought overseas students to fill the financial gap that they're looking for. Those overseas students have compounded our challenges on the requirement in our bigger cities and towns that have got big university populations, have compounded the housing issue by bringing in even more people who are not. When I was at university a very long time ago, I was in Glasgow, and most of the students a large proportion of the students in Glasgow were from Glasgow-based homes. They weren't necessarily going overseas. So, that's another thing that can have an impact, and that's university education. Another thing I just want to touch on, I know I've taken a lot of your time already. One other thing that I'd like to touch on is the impact that climate change can have on our housing stock, particularly relevant to me. I live in a pre-1919 property. I live in a sandstone house. Scotland's got just under 500,000 pre-1919 properties, so they were built. One of the things that always strikes me is I remember flicking through the television a couple of years ago and seeing a documentary that said the west of Scotland is 60% wetter than it was just 50 years ago. It was particularly relevant to me because it was in the year of my 50 that I was 50 years old. So that's a real challenge we've got. We've got 2.5 million residential dwellings, just under in Scotland, and 500,000 of those are pre-1919. Certainly not, and a large chunk, over half of them, were not built for the changes we are seeing in the climate. That must be another really big challenge that government's got to face, is how we deal with our housing stock and matching it up with the challenges of climate.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is where even, especially the social rented sector has no real idea how it's going to be able to meet these two challenges when we're saying build more homes because we've got a housing crisis. And by the way, you need to meet all these climate change targets to have net zero on all your housing stock. And actually the money which this is going to cost just hasn't really been properly also planned. So we know for Scotland to meet net zero targets, it's around about £30 billion. The government have kind of identified around about £3 billion to meet those targets going forward. So there's huge gaps. The private sector are the ones who are being told you're going to have to come forward with that. So I think the two competing challenges we've got of a housing crisis and net zero are going to have to eventually have some understanding over where that's going to be met. The social rented sector already is going to have a different, slower pathway towards those targets. Government's put that in legislation. But being realistic about when we're doing this work and the potential to lose housing stock at the same time. And, the competing challenges, like in Aberdeen, we've seen hundreds of homes lost because of the RAC concern. So I think the challenges we're facing and where the housing numbers are going to go down, if not up, if we're not careful, needs to be really planned in a way I don't see in government, and something I hope our committee work can add value to, because we need that sometimes cross-party watchful eye on these competing policies and where, let's face it, the financial resources aren't available. So what are we actually going to prioritise with all these competing challenges? And like you say, in terms of how we build homes, there's also changes coming forward around passive house, for example. All these things are going to cost huge amounts of additional money, which isn't clear where that's going to come from. For me, I do think the homelessness crisis is one we need to really start focusing on. And that's why I'm quite honest in saying I don't think we should be distracted by a housing bill where the civil servants who should be coordinating government response are all working on that, rather than actually getting us back on track to some of the housing outcomes which Parliament's already passed laws on and has already said we want to see delivered. We're way behind any of that at the moment.
So you just mentioned something there, which is something that you've raised a number of times through media, social media, in Parliament, and that is homelessness. And it seems to be a specific concern of yours. And you mentioned earlier about the increase in people living in temporary accommodation in Edinburgh. If you had a magic wand, is there any one specific thing that you would look to do to try and deal with the homelessness challenge that we've got and that's increasing?
So I wish I did have that magic wand. I think listening to people who are working in the sector, I do a lot with smaller charities, but also national ones like Shelter and Crisis. And I think what is clear is often how you put together sustainable tenancies for people. And that work just hasn't been happening. And so when people who are experiencing homelessness are then presenting at councils, there's very few options available. Now, the fact we've seen so many children in temporary accommodation, I think we need to focus on a specific solution around that. Whether or not there's an opportunity to look towards a ban on children being placed in temporary accommodation. So councils have to look towards trying to keep people in a sustainable tenancy if possible, rather than people declaring themselves homeless, which has a huge amount of stigma for the individuals and their family. And look towards that sort of different model. The preventative work, which we're told will be embedded in the housing bill, that's meant to be happening already in many cases and just isn't. So I do think we probably need to get back to basics on what we're doing to prevent homelessness today, and what different models to support people from presenting homeless in the first place. But one of the key things, at the last election, and I remember this after I was given this portfolio, was one of the key targets we all, as politicians, had in our manifestos was to end rough sleeping. Now, we were making good progress towards saying we had done that by the end of this Parliament. The latest statistics suggest we're now going in the completely polar opposite direction. So I do think probably that is one area we need to see a real focus now. But it's getting us into an emergency response, which is never good because resources are not well used when you're simply trying to do sticking plaster instead of really planning for long-term change. And that's where I do hope ministers will see the warning lights are coming on across the board at the minute, and stop and take stock of that. It was something, like I say, when I had the health portfolio, I was warning about the drug deaths situation, and I was told I was wrong, that the government policies were fine, that this was actually an ageing cohort they used to talk around, until Scotland became the worst country and highest drug deaths in Europe. I worry we could see that around homelessness and housing problems, and compared to most equivalent countries, we shouldn't be seeing that. We should be planning. We have more opportunities, given we have a higher number of social rented sector, to find different solutions. But we need a government who's going to pause, maybe accept they've got this wrong, and look across parties for ideas as well. And we've not really seen that to date.
Okay. Is there one of the things I find interesting when you get to speak to politicians on a one-to-one basis, or listen to many other podcasts, that it's most politicians are not as confrontational as it comes across on the news or programs like Question Time or whatever, and actually they're all trying to achieve the same goal, just to have slightly different nuanced things. So as a final thing, is there anything good that you think that's something the Scottish Government have done well in the last wee while? That's something they should do more of. Is there anything specific that that they've done?
So I agree. I don't think politics should be always confrontational. Interestingly, I had a school group in here recently, and we had quite a serious First Minister's questions. and met with the school group afterwards, and they were really disappointed. They really just wanted everyone shouting at each other. That's how, we've all been brought up as politicians are meant to behave. And that's what we're kind of used to. So one thing which I do think the Scottish Government have finally done well is around trying to look towards kinship carers, for example. That's something I campaigned on when I was elected, and we have now seen a national payment system developed. I think sometimes when politicians can sort of put our guns down, there's an opportunity for us to sort of say, well, let's work on individual projects. Let's actually share our ideas. It's something, when we have debates, for example, people aren't necessarily willing to see that. Yesterday in Parliament, we had a debate around helping parents back into work. And one of the things I put forward and was debating with John Swinney specifically on was around family hubs, because for many people who are trying to get back into work, the integration of what they will need for childcare and transport isn't there. So actually a family hub to support people back into work is a policy idea I think time has come, and I'd like to see us at least pilot that. So we've all got ideas. Sometimes we just need to listen to each other a bit more than shout at each other. The biggest problem, and this is, a political point, I suppose, is so often all we're dragged back to is the divisions around the Constitution, both in terms of Scottish referendum and Brexit, and we need to get beyond that. I think some of the Scottish solutions for Scottish problems, which people thought the Scottish Parliament would help to deliver, have kind of not happened in recent times. And it's something which frustrates me, because one of the reasons I wanted to be an MSP was I thought we could actually collectively try to progress some of these things, bringing all our different left, right, centre politics to that. But we haven't quite got there. I do think we're probably, as a Parliament, needing to focus on that, and probably will soon enough when people finally kind of turn the page on that constitutional argument.
Okay, well, as I say, it's nice to hear politicians not being confrontational all the time. So with that, I will say, Miles Briggs, thanks very much.
Good to speak to you, Brian. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the Scottish Housing Podcast with Stephen Purcell and me, Brian Gilmore. To ensure you don't miss an episode, please follow us and subscribe wherever you pick up your podcasts. To find out more about the presenters, go to scottishhousingpod.com, and to get all the latest information about forthcoming guests and new episodes, follow us on social media at Scottish Housing Pod.
The Scottish Housing Podcast is brought to you by the Right Business Centre. Located just off the M8 in Glasgow, we have office space to suit all companies from the smallest startup to a large corporate business. Right Business Centre also provides virtual office services like mail handling, creating a seamless virtual operation for remote teams or startups. Whatever your business needs, go to rightbusinesscentre.co.uk.
Welcome to the world of hassle-free property management with Indigo Square. As a premier residential lettings and property factoring service, we pride ourselves on tailoring our services to meet the unique needs of each client. Whether you're a landlord seeking a professional agent to handle the complexities of new legislation, or a homeowner in a shared building looking for seamless repair solutions, Indigo Square has got you covered. Say goodbye to stress and hello to peace of mind with Indigo Square. To discover how we can simplify your property management experience, visit our website at www.indigolits.com or drop us a line at info@indigolits.com. Your property deserves the best. Choose Indigo Square.
Introducing 2010 Land Consultancy, a dynamic and specialized team of experts dedicated to navigating the complex world of public affairs, planning consultancy, and business development. Based in Glasgow and serving clients across the UK and beyond, our agile team offers unparalleled expertise to public, private, and civil society organizations. With a strong network of connections in Scotland and beyond, Stephen brings invaluable insights and strategic guidance to every project. So choose 2010 Land Consultancy for innovative solutions, unparalleled expertise, and a commitment to driving success for our clients.